In 1992, workers at Schwinn's Chicago factory came in one morning to find the doors locked. No warning, no severance packages, just a chain across the entrance and a bankruptcy notice taped to the wall. The company that had built 90% of America's bicycles, that had survived 2 world wars and the Great Depression, that had been synonymous with childhood itself for nearly a century, was gone. This wasn't supposed to happen. Schwinn wasn't just another bicycle company. They were the Bicycle Company. The name every kid knew, the brand every parent trusted. At their peak, saying I got a Schwinn was like saying I won. They'd invented the standard American bike, created the dealer network that defined the industry, and built a Chicago factory so efficient it became a model for manufacturers worldwide. But here's what makes this story different from every other American manufacturing collapse you've heard. Schwinn didn't lose to cheaper foreign labor. They didn't get disrupted by some new technology they couldn't understand. They had money. They had brand recognition. They had loyal customers begging to buy their products. What they had was something more dangerous than any of those problems. They had a family so dysfunctional, so trapped in their own success, that they couldn't see the industry transforming around them until it was too late. The story starts in 1895 with a German immigrant named Ignaz Schwinn, who understood something about America that most people missed. This wasn't a country that needed cheap transportation. It was a country that wanted freedom, adventure, the feeling of going somewhere. And in 1895, before cars cluttered the streets, the bicycle was how you got that feeling. Schwinn arrived in Chicago at exactly the right moment. The bicycle craze was exploding. Everybody wanted one. Hundreds of companies were rushing to meet demand, throwing together bikes in garages and warehouses across the city. Most of them built garbage. Frames that cracked, wheels that bent, bikes that lasted maybe 6 months before falling apart. Ignaz saw the opportunity nobody else was seeing. The bicycle boom would eventually crash. It always did with fads. When it crashed, all those fly-by-night operations would disappear. But if someone built bikes that actually lasted, bikes people could trust, that company would own whatever market remained. He partnered with a wealthy meatpacking investor named Adolf Arnold, and together they founded Arnold Schwinn and Company. The strategy was simple, but radical for its time. Build quality so good that people remember your name. Make bikes heavy, sturdy, overbuilt. Engineer them to survive Chicago winters and rough city streets. Price them higher than the competition, and make that premium feel worth it. The bicycle bubble burst right on schedule. By 1905, hundreds of bike companies had vanished, but Schwinn was growing. They'd built something those other companies hadn't. Reputation. When someone bought a Schwinn, it worked. Year after year. The bike your older brother rode you could ride, then your younger sister could ride it. Then you could sell it to a neighbor and it would keep working. Schwinn started buying up the factories of dead competitors, consolidating production in Chicago. By the 1920s, they'd become the largest bicycle manufacturer in America. Not through clever marketing or price wars, but through the boring, unglamorous work of building products that didn't break. Then came the Depression. The crash that destroyed thousands of American manufacturers barely touched Schwinn, because here's what nobody expected. When money got tight, people stopped buying cars, but they still needed to get around. Bicycles became essential again, and when you're spending precious Depression-era dollars on transportation, you don't buy the cheapest option. You buy the one that won't break down. Schwinn's sales actually increased during the Depression. While the rest of American industry collapsed, they were expanding, opening new dealer networks, hiring more workers, building a factory complex in Chicago that would eventually span multiple city blocks. World War II could have destroyed them. The military seized most bicycle production for the war effort. Schwinn's factory was converted to manufacture ammunition and parts for military vehicles. For 4 years, they barely made any civilian bikes. Their dealer network was left with nothing to sell. Any other company would have seen those dealers vanish, picked up by competitors who could still supply inventory. But Schwinn had spent decades building relationships. They'd created a dealer program that was almost unheard of in manufacturing. Exclusive territories, protected margins, training programs, marketing support, real partnerships instead of just transactional supplier relationships. Those dealers waited, because they knew when the war ended, Schwinn would come back strong. They were right. 1946 brought a bicycle boom unlike anything America had ever seen. Soldiers came home, started families, moved to suburbs, and those suburbs were filled with kids who needed bikes. The demand was insane. You couldn't build bikes fast enough. Every manufacturer was running at maximum capacity and still had waiting lists. This was the moment when Schwinn made the decisions that would define them for the next 40 years. Decisions that seemed brilliant at the time but would eventually become chains they couldn't break. First, they doubled down on their dealer network. Instead of selling through department stores like some competitors, Schwinn committed to independent bike shops. They created a network of authorized Schwinn dealers who agreed to strict terms. You couldn't sell Schwinn bikes below a certain price. You had to maintain inventory. You had to provide service and repairs. In exchange, Schwinn gave you an exclusive territory and a brand that basically sold itself. For dealers, it was a gold mine. Schwinn bikes commanded premium prices. Parents wanted them specifically. Kids begged for them. And because Schwinn controlled the supply so tightly, dealers had real pricing power. You couldn't just go to the next shop and get it cheaper because Schwinn made sure there wasn't a next shop in your area. Second, Schwinn vertically integrated everything. They didn't just assemble bikes. They manufactured their own frames, their own wheels, their own components. The Chicago factory became a self-contained bicycle manufacturing ecosystem. Raw steel came in one end, finished bikes rolled out the other. This gave them incredible quality control and kept their costs predictable. Third, they invested in innovation, but only the kind that reinforced their image. In 1946, they introduced the Schwinn Phantom, and it wasn't just a bike. It was a statement. Chrome everywhere. Tank design borrowed from motorcycles. Built-in horn, deluxe Springer fork. It looked like something from the future, and it was built to last forever. Kids saved for months to buy one. Parents knew it would outlast childhood. The Phantom established a template Schwinn would follow for decades. Make bikes that looked distinctive, felt premium, and cost more than the competition. Then make them so durable that the price felt justified. It worked spectacularly. By 1950, Schwinn was producing over 1 million bikes per year. The Chicago factory ran 3 shifts, thousands of workers. The brand was everywhere. Every neighborhood had a Schwinn dealer. Every kid knew someone who had a Schwinn. The company had achieved something remarkable. They'd made a commodity product into a status symbol. The 50s were Schwinn's golden age. They introduced the Corvette, the Jaguar, the Panther. Each model targeted a specific segment but all shared the same DNA. Heavy steel frames, overbuilt components, that distinctive Schwinn look, and most importantly, they all came from the Chicago factory where quality could be obsessively controlled. Frank W. Schwinn, Ignaz's son, ran the company with an iron fist. He believed in the family business model. The factory employed second and third generation workers, families who'd been building Schwinn bikes for decades. The dealer network was filled with shops that had been Schwinn only since the 30s. Everything was about loyalty, relationships, tradition. This approach created something powerful but also something fragile. Schwinn wasn't just a company. It was an ecosystem held together by personal relationships and shared history. The dealers trusted Schwinn. The workers were proud of what they built. The customers believed in the brand. As long as nothing changed, the system was unbeatable. But in 1963, something did change. Frank W. Schwinn died, and control passed to his son, Edward Schwinn Jr. And this is where the real story begins. Because Edward inherited an empire at the exact moment when everything his father had built was about to become obsolete. Edward Schwinn Jr. took control in 1963 with absolute confidence. Why wouldn't he? The company was printing money. The Chicago factory was running at capacity. Dealer relationships were rock solid. Schwinn controlled roughly 25% of the American bike market, and in the premium segment they were virtually unopposed. Edward saw himself as a modernizer. His father had been old school, resistant to change, obsessed with doing things the traditional way. Edward thought differently. He looked at Schwinn and saw inefficiencies everywhere. The dealer network was too rigid. The manufacturing process was too labor-intensive. The product line was too limited. He had ideas, big ideas, about how to transform Schwinn from a family business into a modern corporation. His first major decision seemed perfectly logical. Schwinn needed to expand beyond adult bikes and kids' cruisers. They needed to enter the emerging lightweight market. European racing bikes were gaining popularity. Collegiate riders wanted something faster, lighter, more sophisticated than the tank-like Schwinns. Edward decided to create the Schwinn Varsity, a 10-speed road bike that would bring the Schwinn name into this new category. There was just one problem. Building lightweight bikes required different materials, different techniques, different expertise than the heavy cruisers Schwinn had perfected. The Chicago factory was optimized for one thing: churning out steel frame bikes using methods that hadn't changed much since the 40s. Retooling would be expensive and complicated. So Edward made a decision that seemed smart but would prove catastrophic. Instead of manufacturing the Varsity in Chicago, Schwinn would outsource production to a Japanese company called Panasonic. They'd build the frames and components, Schwinn would import them, slap their badge on, and sell them through the dealer network. It was efficient, it was cost-effective. It was exactly what a modern, forward-thinking executive would do. The Varsity launched in 1963 and sold incredibly well. Schwinn had successfully entered a new market segment without the headache of retooling their factory. Wall Street would have loved it if Schwinn had been public. Business schools would have called it smart strategic sourcing. Edward felt vindicated. His father's way wasn't the only way, but something subtle had shifted. For the first time in Schwinn's history, bikes with their name on them weren't coming from the Chicago factory. The workers noticed, the dealers noticed, and most importantly, a blueprint had been established. When you need to do something the factory can't handle efficiently, you outsource it. That blueprint would be followed again and again over the next decade. The Continental, another lightweight model, went to the same Japanese manufacturer, then the Supersport, then the World Traveller. Each time the logic was identical. Why invest in expensive factory upgrades when you can contract it out cheaper? The Chicago factory kept building the traditional heavy bikes, the Phantoms and Stingrays and Cruisers. But increasingly the growth was happening in categories Schwinn didn't manufacture themselves. The company was slowly becoming something it had never been before, a brand manager rather than a manufacturer. Then came the Stingray, and for a moment it seemed like everything would be fine. 1963 wasn't just the year Edward took over. It was the year Schwinn's design team created something that would define childhood for an entire generation. The Stingray wasn't based on any existing bike. It was inspired by motorcycles and custom cars. High handlebars, banana seats, sissy bar, stick shift, small frame. It looked dangerous and rebellious and absolutely nothing like a traditional bicycle. Al Fritz, Schwinn's head of engineering, designed it specifically for kids who wanted to feel like they were riding a chopper. The first prototype was mocked up in the Schwinn design shop, and when they showed it to dealers, the reaction was mixed. Some thought it was brilliant, others thought it was a joke. Edward approved production anyway. The Stingray launched in 1963, and within months it was the hottest toy in America. Kids went insane for it. Every playground had Stingray races, every driveway had kids doing wheelies. The design was so distinctive that you could spot one from a block away. Schwinn couldn't build them fast enough. By 1968, the Stingray represented 70% of Schwinn's juvenile bike sales. 70%. Competitors rushed to copy it, but none had Schwinn's distribution muscle or brand cachet. The Chicago factory ran extra shifts just to keep up with Stingray demand. It was Schwinn's biggest hit since the Phantom, and it seemed to prove that the company still had magic. But here's what Edward didn't fully appreciate. The Stingray succeeded because it came from Chicago. It was designed by Schwinn engineers, built by Schwinn workers, using Schwinn's manufacturing expertise. It was exactly the kind of innovation that the vertically integrated model enabled. You could iterate quickly, maintain quality, scale production, all because everything happened under one roof. The lesson Edward took away was different. He saw the Stingray as proof that Schwinn's brand was so strong it could sell anything. The manufacturing didn't matter. What mattered was the name on the frame. If kids wanted Schwinn, they'd buy Schwinn regardless of where it was made. This misunderstanding would define everything that came next. Throughout the late 60s, Schwinn continued thriving financially. The Stingray was a cash machine. The lightweight imports were growing. Traditional adult bikes still sold steadily. Revenue climbed year after year. The dealer network remained loyal. From the outside, Schwinn looked unstoppable, but cracks were forming in the foundation. The relationship between Schwinn and its dealers, once the company's greatest strength, was starting to fray. Exclusive territory agreements that had made dealers rich were now making them complacent. Many Schwinn dealers had gotten lazy. They'd been handed a monopoly on the most desirable brand and hadn't faced real competition in years. Service got sloppy. Sales techniques got outdated. Stores started looking tired. Edward noticed this and it frustrated him. He wanted dealers to be more aggressive, more professional, more like modern retailers. But the franchise agreements his father had signed gave dealers ironclad protection. Schwinn couldn't easily replace underperforming dealers because the contracts guaranteed territorial exclusivity. You were stuck with whoever was there. Edwards started pushing dealers harder. More inventory requirements, higher sales quotas, mandatory training programs. Some dealers responded positively, others resented the pressure. The paternalistic relationship that had defined Schwinn's dealer network for decades was becoming transactional and tense. Meanwhile, something else was happening that Schwinn was slow to recognize. The bicycle market itself was changing fundamentally. Throughout the 50s and early 60s, bikes had been primarily for kids. Adults didn't ride bikes except occasionally for leisure. But in the late 60s, that started shifting. The environmental movement made cycling seem virtuous. The fitness craze made it seem healthy. Urban congestion made it seem practical. Suddenly, adults wanted bikes not as toys, but as serious transportation and exercise equipment. This created demand for a completely different kind of bicycle. Lightweight, efficient, multi-geared, designed for performance rather than durability. European manufacturers had been building these bikes for decades. Peugeot, Raleigh, Motobecane. They knew how to make bikes that weighed 25 pounds instead of 50. They understood derailleurs and handbrakes and aluminum components. When American adults started wanting serious bikes, they turned to European imports because American manufacturers, Schwinn included, were still mentally stuck in the kids' cruiser market. Schwinn tried to compete with their Japanese-made lightweights, the Varsity and Continental. They sold respectably. But serious cyclists knew these weren't real performance bikes. They were heavy. The components were mediocre. They were beginner bikes masquerading as racing bikes. If you actually wanted to ride seriously, you bought European. This should have been a wake-up call. The market was moving away from Schwinn's core competency. They were the best in the world at building heavy, durable, simple bikes. But increasingly consumers wanted the opposite. Light, efficient, complex bikes. And Schwinn's entire infrastructure, their factory, their supply chain, their engineering expertise, was optimized for the old category. Edwards' response was to double down on outsourcing. If Schwinn couldn't build lightweight bikes efficiently in Chicago, they'd import more models from Japan. If dealers couldn't sell enough volume, they'd add more dealers. If the factory workers resisted changes, they'd work around them. Every problem got solved by moving further away from the model that had built the empire. Nobody seemed to notice that Schwinn was hollowing itself out. The brand was still strong, sales were still growing, profits were still healthy. But the foundation was eroding. Manufacturing expertise was being lost as more production moved overseas. Dealer loyalty was weakening as relationships became more adversarial. The connection between the Schwinn name and Chicago craftsmanship was dissolving. And then in 1973, everything got dramatically worse. The OPEC oil embargo triggered a massive spike in oil prices. Gas went from 30 cents a gallon to over $1. Americans who'd never considered bicycles for transportation suddenly needed them desperately. Bike sales exploded. This should have been Schwinn's greatest moment. Instead, it exposed just how vulnerable they'd become. The oil crisis hit Schwinn like a hurricane, except instead of destroying them, it revealed that the house was already collapsing. When gas prices tripled and Americans panicked, bike shops couldn't keep inventory on shelves. Lines formed outside stores. People bought anything with two wheels. The entire industry went into emergency production mode, scrambling to meet demand that decreased by hundreds of % overnight. Schwinn should have dominated this moment. They were the biggest bike brand in America with the most established distribution network and the strongest reputation. But they couldn't deliver. Their Japanese suppliers, overwhelmed with orders from multiple American brands, couldn't ramp up production fast enough. The Chicago factory was already running at capacity and couldn't expand quickly. Giant's facility in Taiwan was still small and limited. Meanwhile, competitors who'd built more flexible supply chains surged ahead. Companies that had relationships with multiple Asian manufacturers could source bikes from whoever had capacity. Brands that had invested in diverse production facilities could shift volume around. Schwinn, locked into their specific supplier relationships and their aging Chicago factory, watched market share slip away during the biggest sales boom in cycling history. Dealers were furious. They had customers literally waving cash, begging for bikes, and Schwinn couldn't supply enough inventory. Store owners who'd been loyal to Schwinn for decades started carrying other brands just to have something to sell. Once those other brands were in the shop, once customers discovered that Peugeot or Raleigh made perfectly good bikes, Schwinn's stranglehold on distribution began cracking. The boom lasted through 74 and into 75. By the time gas prices stabilized and the panic subsided, the American bike market had fundamentally transformed. Millions of adults who'd never considered cycling now owned bikes and were potentially long-term customers. The total market had expanded dramatically, but something else had changed too. During the shortage, consumers had been forced to try other brands. They discovered that Schwinn wasn't the only option. The mystique had been punctured. Schwinn was no longer the default choice. They were just another brand competing for attention. Edward recognized the crisis, but his solution made things worse. Schwinn needed more production capacity immediately. The Chicago factory couldn't expand further. The Paramount line, their high-end racing bikes still handmade in Chicago, was too small and specialized to matter for volume. Japanese suppliers were maxed out. So Edward turned to Giant, the Taiwanese manufacturer that had been making some of their lower-end models. He dramatically increased their orders, asking Giant to become Schwinn's primary production partner for the mass market. It made financial sense. Taiwan's manufacturing costs were even lower than Japan's. Giant was hungry for the business and willing to invest in expansion, but this decision accelerated Schwinn's loss of control over their own product. Giant wasn't just stamping out frames to Schwinn specifications anymore. They were taking on complete bike assembly, managing components, making manufacturing decisions. Schwinn was increasingly just a brand name slapped on bikes they didn't actually make. The Chicago workers saw what was happening. Every year, more production moved overseas. Every year, the factory workforce shrank. The pride of building Schwinns, of being craftsmen carrying on a tradition, was disappearing. Union relations, never great under Edward's management, turned openly hostile. In 1976, the Chicago factory workers went on strike. The issues were partly about wages and benefits, but underneath was something deeper. These workers understood they were becoming obsolete. The company was systematically moving production away from them. The strike was about dignity as much as dollars. Edward's response was cold and strategic. He used the strike as an opportunity to permanently reduce the Chicago workforce. When production resumed, fewer workers came back. More volume had been shifted to Taiwan. The message was clear. The factory workers who'd built Schwinn's reputation were expendable. This destroyed something intangible but crucial. Schwinn had always been able to say their bikes were American-made, built by skilled craftsmen in Chicago. That story, that connection to quality and tradition, had been a huge part of the brand's appeal. Now it was becoming fiction. The Paramount line still operated in Chicago, hand-building high-end racing bikes. But Paramounts represented a tiny fraction of sales. They were a prestige product, not the core business. The average consumer buying a Schwinn Varsity from a dealer in Nebraska had no idea their bike was now made in Taiwan by a company they'd never heard of. And here's where the story takes a turn that nobody at Schwinn anticipated. Giant was learning. Every bike they built for Schwinn taught them more about design, engineering, and manufacturing. They were studying Schwinn's methods, improving them, becoming more sophisticated. King Liu, Giant's founder, understood that being a contract manufacturer was just the first step. The real money came from building your own brand. Throughout the late 70s, Giant quietly began developing their own designs. They used the infrastructure that Schwinn had helped them build, the expertise they'd gained from Schwinn's specifications, the manufacturing processes they'd refined while making Schwinn bikes. They were preparing to become a competitor, and Schwinn either didn't notice or didn't take it seriously. Edward was focused on other problems. Dealer relations kept deteriorating. The old paternalistic model was completely dead. Schwinn tried to maintain control through franchise agreements, but dealers increasingly resented restrictions on what else they could carry and how they could sell. The exclusive territory protection that had once been an asset now felt like a cage. Some dealers wanted to expand into multiple locations. Schwinn's rules made that difficult. Others wanted to carry complementary brands for products Schwinn didn't make. Schwinn resisted. The company that had invented the modern dealer network was now being strangled by their own creation. New competitors weren't burdened with these legacy relationships. Specialized, Trek, Cannondale. These emerging American brands could build dealer networks from scratch, offering better margins and more flexibility. They could focus on the growing adult performance market that Schwinn was still trying to serve with modified kids' bikes. Trek's story is particularly instructive. Founded in Wisconsin in 1976, they started by building steel touring frames. High quality, focused on serious cyclists, priced competitively with European imports. They offered dealers simple terms, better margins than Schwinn. No complicated franchise agreements, just good bikes and fair business. Trek's timing was perfect. The adult cycling market was exploding, triathlons were becoming popular, mountain biking was emerging as a sport. These new categories needed specialized equipment, and Trek was designing bikes specifically for these uses, while Schwinn was still mentally in the cruiser and 10-speed world. By the early 80s, Trek had become a legitimate competitor. Specialized was growing fast. Cannondale was making waves with aluminum frames, and European brands continued dominating the high end. Schwinn was being squeezed from every direction. Edwards' response was to protect margins by cutting costs. More production moved overseas, component quality decreased. The bikes that had once been overbuilt to last forever were now built to a price point. Dealers noticed, customers noticed. The bikes just weren't as good. There's a particular irony here. Ignaz Schwinn had built the company on the principle that quality justified premium pricing. Frank had maintained that standard even when it was expensive. Edward, facing real competitive pressure for the first time, abandoned the philosophy that had created the empire. He was trying to compete on price with manufacturers whose entire advantage was price. Meanwhile, the Chicago factory continued shrinking. By 1980, it employed a fraction of its peak workforce. The massive facility that had once represented American manufacturing dominance was increasingly empty. Whole sections sat unused. The remaining workers knew they were watching something die. The Paramount line remained, still hand-built by master craftsmen, but Paramounts were almost a separate company within Schwinn. They operated independently, maintained old standards, and served a tiny niche of serious racers and collectors. They were a museum piece, a reminder of what Schwinn used to be. And then came the revelation that would eventually destroy everything. In 1981, Giant introduced their own brand of bicycles, not contract manufacturing for others. Their own designs, their own brand, competing directly with Schwinn and every other company they'd been building bikes for. The bikes were good. Really good. Giant had learned from everyone. They combined Japanese efficiency with American design sensibilities and Taiwanese cost advantages. They offered serious performance at prices that undercut established brands. And they had something Schwinn no longer possessed. Modern manufacturing facilities designed for current market demands rather than legacy infrastructure from the 30s. Schwinn executives were reportedly shocked. How could their contract manufacturer become a competitor? But the answer was obvious to anyone paying attention. They'd taught Giant everything. They'd helped build Giant's factories. They'd transferred their expertise. And now Giant was using all of it against them. This pattern would repeat across the industry. Contract manufacturers in Asia learned from American brands, then launched their own products. It's the natural evolution when you outsource not just production, but also your manufacturing expertise. You're training your future competition. Edward tried to respond by diversifying Schwinn's supplier base, reducing dependence on Giant, but the damage was done. Giant had the knowledge and the infrastructure. Other Taiwanese manufacturers were following the same path. The entire foundation of Schwinn's business model, cheap Asian production of American designs, was collapsing because the manufacturers no longer needed the American brands. By 1983, Schwinn was caught in a perfect storm. The Chicago factory was hemorrhaging money. Competition was intensifying from every direction. Quality had declined noticeably, and most dangerously, the company's entire supply chain was becoming its competitor. Edward Schwinn's response was to double down on what had been working. More overseas production, more cost-cutting, more models aimed at the mass market. It was logical in a spreadsheet sense. The numbers said this was the path to profitability, but numbers don't capture everything. That year, Schwinn introduced mountain bikes to their lineup, the Sidewinder and the Sierra. They looked like mountain bikes. They had the fat tires and the upright handlebars, but they were built using Schwinn's traditional approach: heavy frames, outdated geometry, components chosen for cost rather than performance. Trek's mountain bikes were lighter. Specialized actually understood the sport. These companies employed riders who tested their products in real conditions. Schwinn's design process was happening in Chicago boardrooms and Taiwanese factories, disconnected from the trails where these bikes would be used. The gap was obvious to anyone who rode both. A Schwinn mountain bike was fine for casual riding around the neighborhood, but take it on an actual mountain trail and the limitations became glaring. The geometry was wrong. The bike didn't handle technical terrain properly. Components failed under stress. Bike shops started actively steering serious customers away from Schwinn. If you want a real mountain bike, look at Trek or Specialized. This was devastating because shops had been Schwinn's loyal army for decades. Now they were recommending competitors. Edward tried to fix this through marketing rather than product improvement. Schwinn spent heavily on advertising, promoting their mountain bikes with images of rugged terrain and athletic riders. But marketing can't overcome a fundamental product problem. When customers bought the bikes and discovered they weren't actually good for serious mountain biking, word spread quickly. The cycling community is tight. Enthusiasts talk to each other, they read magazines, they share experiences, and by the mid-80s, the consensus among serious riders was clear. Schwinn had fallen behind. Then, in 1985, something unthinkable happened. The United Auto Workers Union, which represented Schwinn's Chicago factory workers, went on strike. The issues were predictable. Wages hadn't kept pace with inflation. Working conditions had deteriorated as the factory aged. Job security was non-existent as production continued shifting overseas. For most companies, a strike is a crisis. For Schwinn, it was almost convenient. Edward didn't fight to end the strike. He simply shifted more production to Taiwan. Giant and other manufacturers absorbed the additional volume easily. When the strike finally ended after 13 months, it didn't matter. The Chicago factory reopened with a skeleton crew. Most production was permanently gone. The workers who came back knew they were watching the final act. Here's what makes this particularly tragic. Those workers represented generations of manufacturing expertise. They knew things about building bicycles that couldn't be taught in a manual. The geometry of frames, the feel of proper welds, the small adjustments that made a bike rideable rather than just assembled. When that knowledge walked out the door, it didn't come back. Schwinn became entirely dependent on contract manufacturers who were good at production but didn't carry Schwinn's legacy of craftsmanship. The mass-market strategy was failing too. Department stores like Toys R Us and Walmart were carrying Schwinn bikes, which seemed like success. But these weren't the Schwinns of previous generations. They were cheap bikes with the Schwinn name. Heavy, poorly assembled, components that failed quickly. Parents bought them thinking they were getting quality. Kids rode them and had terrible experiences. The bikes were hard to pedal. The brakes barely worked. Everything felt wrong. And because these were mass-market channels, there was no dealer support, no tune-ups, no adjustments, just a bike in a box that probably wasn't even assembled correctly. Every one of those bikes damaged Schwinn's reputation. A kid who got a department store Schwinn in 1985 learned one lesson: Schwinn makes garbage. That kid grew up and never considered Schwinn again. Meanwhile, the enthusiast market was completely lost. Serious cyclists wouldn't touch Schwinn. The brand had become associated with cheap department store bikes. When a real rider said they owned a Schwinn, they meant a vintage Paramount from the 70s, nothing current. Edward tried various fixes, new models, new marketing campaigns, partnership discussions with other manufacturers, but he was trying to solve a strategic problem with tactical adjustments. The fundamental issue was that Schwinn no longer stood for anything clear. Were they a premium brand or a mass-market brand? Were they for serious cyclists or casual riders? Were they American-made quality or cheap imports? Nobody knew anymore, including Schwinn. Trek and Specialized knew exactly what they were. Performance brands for serious riders. They charged premium prices and delivered premium products. Their marketing was consistent. Their dealer networks were strong. Their products kept improving. Cannondale was pioneering aluminum frames that were lighter and stiffer than steel. They weren't constrained by legacy manufacturing designed for steel. They built new facilities optimized for aluminum. Schwinn's Chicago factory couldn't pivot to aluminum production without massive investment that Edward wasn't willing to make. The mountain bike boom that should have been Schwinn's salvation became their funeral. This was the biggest growth category in cycling. Millions of people were discovering off-road riding. Entire new market segments were opening up, and Schwinn was a marginal player, losing ground yearly. By 1988, the situation was desperate. Schwinn was losing money on operations, the brand value was declining. Dealers were dropping the line. The Chicago factory was essentially defunct. Edward needed capital, and he needed it fast. He tried to take Schwinn private through a leverage buyout, borrowing heavily against the company's assets. The plan was to restructure away from public scrutiny, fix the operational problems, then potentially go public again later. It was a gamble, and it failed. The buyout loaded Schwinn with debt just as the market was becoming more competitive. The interest payments were crushing. There was no money for product development or marketing. The company that had once been absurdly profitable was now struggling to make payroll. Quality declined further. Schwinn bikes in the late 80s were arguably the worst they'd ever produced. Cheap frames, terrible components, poor assembly. They were trading entirely on brand recognition from decades earlier, and that recognition was fading fast. Here's a specific example that illustrates how far things had fallen. In 1989, Schwinn introduced a mountain bike called the Impact. It was supposed to compete with serious trail bikes from Trek and Specialized. The frame geometry was dated, the components were entry-level, and it weighed nearly 40 pounds, absurdly heavy for a mountain bike. Bike magazines reviewed it, and were brutal. This isn't a mountain bike. This is a heavy cruiser with knobby tyres. One reviewer wrote that riding it uphill felt like punishment. The Impact failed completely. It became a symbol of Schwinn's decline. They couldn't even get the basics right anymore. The factory workers who remained knew they were building inferior products. But what could they do? They followed specifications from management. They used the components they were given. They assembled bikes designed by people who apparently didn't ride. In 1991, the inevitable happened. Schwinn filed for bankruptcy, not reorganization, liquidation bankruptcy. The company was done. Assets would be sold to pay creditors. The Schwinn family would lose control of the business Ignaz had founded 96 years earlier. The bankruptcy filing made national news. Schwinn wasn't just another failed business, it was an American institution. The brand had been part of childhood for multiple generations, and now it was gone. Edward Schwinn gave interviews trying to explain what happened. He blamed competition, he blamed changing markets, he blamed overseas manufacturers, he blamed unions. What he didn't do was accept responsibility for the decisions that destroyed the company. The truth was obvious to everyone watching. Schwinn failed because it abandoned the principles that made it successful. Quality was sacrificed for cost savings. Manufacturing expertise was outsourced to future competitors. The brand was diluted across too many market segments, and management was consistently reactive rather than innovative. Frank Schwinn had made mistakes too. He'd been stubborn about technology. He'd missed opportunities. But he'd never compromised on quality. He'd never allowed the Schwinn name to appear on garbage products. Edward had done exactly that, and it killed the company. The bankruptcy court began the process of selling assets. The Paramount line was sold separately to a group that would continue making high-end frames. The Chicago factory was shuttered permanently. Equipment was auctioned off. Real estate was sold. The Schwinn name itself, the brand, was sold to a holding company that planned to license it. And just like that, one of the great American manufacturing stories ended, not with triumph, but with whimper. A brand that had defined American cycling for nearly a century was reduced to a trademark being sold to the highest bidder. The bankruptcy sale happened fast. Scott Sports Group, a company better known for ski equipment and goggles, bought the Schwinn name and remaining assets for just $25 million. $25 million. For a brand that had once been worth hundreds of millions, it was a fire sale. The new owners had zero interest in American manufacturing. They immediately moved all production overseas, Taiwan, China, wherever bikes could be made cheaply. The Chicago factory that had built millions of bicycles over 8 decades was demolished. Workers who'd spent their entire careers at Schwinn were out of work with nowhere to go. The city lost another piece of its industrial heritage. Scott Sports licensed the Schwinn name to various manufacturers and retailers. Within a few years, you could buy a Schwinn at Target, Walmart, Kmart, anywhere that sold cheap bikes. The brand that once represented quality and American manufacturing was now stuck on department store bikes assembled by minimum wage workers who'd never touched a bike tool before purchasing. A Schwinn was now synonymous with cheap, disposable, entry-level, the exact opposite of what it had meant for 90 years. In the bike enthusiast community, Schwinn became a joke. Forums and message boards mocked the brand relentlessly. People posted photos of broken Schwinn frames with captions like, "Built Schwinn tough." The contempt was brutal but earned. Trek, Specialized, Cannondale and Giant dominated the serious cycling market. Schwinn was for kids and people who didn't know any better. Here's what's particularly tragic. The Schwinn name still carried weight with older consumers. Baby boomers remembered their Stingrays and Varsities fondly. Parents who'd grown up riding Schwinns wanted to buy Schwinns for their children. That nostalgia drove sales for years. But it was false advertising. The bikes these parents bought bore no resemblance to the Schwinns they remembered. Different factories, different materials, different standards, different everything. Only the logo was the same. Those customers felt betrayed when the bikes fell apart, when the frames cracked, when components failed after minimal use. They'd trusted a brand they'd loved as children, and that trust was violated. The damage went beyond individual sales. It poisoned the brand for another generation. Kids who got cheap Schwinns as their first bikes formed negative associations that would last for life. By the early 2000s, Schwinn had changed hands multiple times. Each new owner saw it as a licensing opportunity, a recognizable name they could slap on cheap products to move units. Nobody cared about rebuilding the brand properly. Nobody invested in quality or innovation. It was pure exploitation of legacy. Then, in 2004, something unexpected happened. Durell Industries, a Canadian company, acquired Schwinn along with several other bicycle brands. And surprisingly, they actually tried to fix it. Not completely, not back to Frank Schwinn standards, but they made genuine efforts to improve quality and rebuild some credibility. Durell created different product tiers. The department store bikes continued. Those were still cheap and disposable, but they also introduced higher-end models through bike shops. Better frames, better components, better assembly. They brought back classic names like the Paramount and Stingray, not as faithful recreations but as reimagined modern versions. They hired actual bike designers who understood geometry and performance. The cycling community remained skeptical. Decades of garbage products couldn't be erased overnight. But slowly, grudgingly, some enthusiasts acknowledged that certain Schwinn models were no longer complete junk. Not great, but acceptable for the price point. The vintage Schwinn market exploded during this period. Original bikes from the 50s, 60s and 70s became highly collectible. A pristine Paramount from the 70s could sell for thousands. Even basic models like the Continental gained value. People wanted real Schwinns, bikes built in Chicago when quality mattered. The contrast with modern Schwinns was stark and depressing. Today in 2025, Schwinn exists in a strange limbo. The brand is everywhere. You can buy a Schwinn at almost any retailer that sells bikes, but it means nothing. There's no coherent identity. A $70 Schwinn from Walmart shares shelf space conceptually with a $1,500 Schwinn from a bike shop. Same logo, completely different products, wildly different quality levels. The enthusiast market ignores Schwinn entirely. Trek, Specialized, Cannondale, Santa Cruz, these are the brands serious cyclists discuss. Schwinn doesn't enter the conversation except as historical reference or cautionary tale. The brand that invented the American cycling industry is irrelevant to American cycling culture. Walk into any serious bike shop and ask about Schwinn. The employees will be polite but dismissive. They'll point you toward brands they actually respect. Brands built on innovation and quality rather than exploiting nostalgia. The Schwinn legacy exists only in the past. Everything after 1982 is just corporate zombie shambling forward wearing a famous corpse's skin. What makes this story particularly instructive is how completely avoidable it was. Schwinn didn't fail because of bad luck or circumstances beyond their control. They failed because of specific, identifiable, preventable decisions, outsourcing manufacturing to future competitors. That was a choice. Prioritizing cost over quality. That was a choice. Ignoring the mountain bike revolution. That was a choice. Diluting the brand across every market segment. That was a choice. Each decision made sense in isolation. Save money, enter new markets, respond to competition. But collectively they destroyed everything Ignaz and Frank Schwinn had built. Edward Schwinn wasn't stupid or malicious. He was short-sighted. He optimized for quarterly results rather than generational sustainability. The broader lesson extends far beyond bicycles. American manufacturing declined throughout the late 20th century following the exact same pattern. Companies that had dominated their industries for decades made identical mistakes. Outsource production, cut quality, trade on legacy. Then wonder why customers stopped buying. Some survived by pivoting before it was too late. Harley-Davidson nearly died in the 80s, but fought back by focusing on quality and brand identity. IBM abandoned hardware manufacturing but dominated software and services. Companies that recognized existential threats early enough could adapt. Schwinn never adapted. They clung to the belief that their name alone would sustain them, that customers would keep buying inferior products because of nostalgia and habit. They were wrong. Brand loyalty has limits. Eventually, you have to deliver value. The current owners of the Schwinn name will continue extracting whatever value remains. They'll keep licensing it to manufacturers. They'll keep selling cheap bikes to uninformed consumers. The brand will persist as long as there's profit to be made. But it will never mean what it once meant. That opportunity is gone forever. There are occasional rumours about bringing manufacturing back to America, about creating a premium Schwinn line built to original standards. It would be technically possible. The expertise exists, the market exists. Plenty of consumers would pay for American-made quality. But it won't happen. Too expensive, too risky. Easier to keep doing what they're doing. The real Schwinn died in 1992 when the bankruptcy court finalised the asset sale. Everything since has been posthumous, a famous name attached to products that bear no relation to what made that name famous. It's intellectual property exploitation masquerading as continuity. Visit Chicago today and you'll find almost no trace of Schwinn's manufacturing empire. The factory is gone. The offices are gone. The buildings that housed one of the world's largest bicycle operations are parking lots and condos. A small historical marker notes that Schwinn once operated there. That's it. The Schwinn family has no involvement with the brand. Edward Schwinn died in 2011. His children pursued other careers. The family name remains on bikes, but the family itself moved on decades ago. They watched their inheritance get sold off piece by piece. There was nothing they could do. In bike museums and collections, vintage Schwinns are displayed with reverence. Curators explain what these bikes represented, how they defined American cycling, how they were built by craftsmen who took pride in their work. Visitors look at them and struggle to connect these beautiful machines with the Schwinns they see at Walmart. That disconnect is the entire story. The gap between what Schwinn was and what it became. Between Frank Schwinn's obsessive quality standards and Edward Schwinn's cost-cutting. Between Chicago manufacturing and Chinese assembly lines. Between a brand that meant something and a trademark that means nothing. The decline took less than 15 years. From industry leader to bankruptcy. From America's bike to disposable commodity. From respected name to punchline. It happened fast because the erosion was systematic and relentless. Each compromise enabled the next. Each cost cut made the next one easier. Schwinn could have been Trek. They could have been specialized. They had every advantage. History, reputation, infrastructure, expertise, market position. They threw it all away, chasing short-term profits and refusing to adapt. Now they're a cautionary tale taught in business schools alongside brands like Kodak, Blockbuster, and Sears. The lesson is obvious, but apparently difficult to internalize. Quality matters. Manufacturing expertise matters. Brand integrity matters. Customer trust once lost cannot be recovered. These aren't abstract principles. They're practical realities demonstrated by decades of corporate failures. Schwinn's story isn't about nostalgia for a bygone era. It's about the consequences of prioritizing everything except the product itself. The bike that carried America through the 20th century couldn't carry itself through changing times. And that's the ultimate irony. Schwinn spent 100 years teaching America that quality justifies premium prices, that craftsmanship matters, that a well-made bicycle is an investment, not an expense. Then, in their final decades, they abandoned every one of those principles while expecting customers to keep believing the lesson. The workers who built those Chicago Schwinns understood something. Management forgot. You can't fake quality. You can't market your way around inferior products. You can't trade on reputation indefinitely while destroying the foundation that created it. Those workers watched it happen in real time. They saw the specifications get cheaper. They saw production move overseas. They knew what was coming years before the bankruptcy. What's left now is a name. Just a name. Stuck on bikes that have nothing to do with the company that made that name valuable. It's corporate necromancy. Taking something dead and animating its corpse for profit. The real Schwinn, the one that mattered, ended the day those Chicago factory doors locked for the last time. There's no resurrection coming. No redemption arc. The expertise is gone. The craftsmen are gone. The culture that produced those bikes doesn't exist anymore. You can't rebuild something like that once it's been dismantled. The knowledge dies with the people who held it. Every cheap department store Schwinn sold today damages the legacy a little more. Every kid who gets one as their first bike and has a terrible experience learns that Schwinn means garbage. The brand isn't being preserved. It's being slowly erased, replaced with something that uses the same letters but means the opposite. That's what happens when you mistake a brand for the thing that created the brand. Schwinn wasn't valuable because of the logo. It was valuable because of what the logo represented. American manufacturing, quality craftsmanship, bikes built to last generations. When you remove everything the logo stood for and keep only the logo itself, you're left with nothing. An empty symbol that consumers eventually see through. The bicycle industry moved on without Schwinn decades ago. The brands that matter now were built on the principles Schwinn abandoned. Trek makes great bikes because they never stopped caring about quality. Specialized dominates because they stayed connected to actual riders. Cannondale innovated while Schwinn stagnated. The market rewarded companies that focused on the product and punished those who didn't. Schwinn had a 100-year head start and lost to companies that didn't exist when they were at their peak. That's not competition. That's self-destruction. You don't get to blame the market when you systematically dismantle everything that made you successful. The Chicago factory is gone. The workers scattered. The expertise lost. The reputation destroyed. What remains is a cautionary tale about what happens when management forgets why customers actually bought their product in the first place. Schwinn didn't fall because the world changed. They fell because they refused to change with it, while simultaneously abandoning what made them special. That's the real lesson here. Not that American manufacturing died, not that foreign competition was inevitable, but that companies destroy themselves through 1,000 small compromises that seem reasonable individually but collectively prove fatal. Schwinn chose death. They just did it slowly enough that nobody noticed until it was too late to save them.